All right. Well, thanks for the introduction, Mark. And you're right. That was kind of what started this conversation about air toxics. And I know working with this group and with my Region 5 folks that not every state looks at air toxics the same. And I feel like, of course, as you guys all know me, that we have a pretty unique program in Michigan. And I really appreciate it. And I also really appreciate getting to work with the folks that you guys are going to hear from today. Obviously, this is a little bit of a Michigan perspective, so take out of it what you will. But we're going to talk about Michigan's air toxics regulations, primarily from a permitting perspective. So in Michigan, and I'm not going to steal any thunder here from the folks that I have on, and I'll introduce them in just a second, but we have a pretty robust program. And I think it's to the chagrin of some of the regulated community, but it also is of a great benefit to, and it's very detailed and in-depth and interesting. So who I brought with you to talk to you today is I've got kind of like a little mini team of one of our air permitting groups. So we've got Chuku OJ, who is an air permit engineer, and I'll kind of give his little bio as I introduce him, but he writes air permits for a wide variety of sources. He focuses on coating operations, scrap metal shredders, which him and I have had some very interesting public meetings for shredders, and we have more in our more immediate future coming up, and chemical plants. And so the permits that he writes include a lot of technical information that incorporates the air toxic regulations. So anybody who's coming in for an air permit in Michigan has to look at those regulations and determine whether or not they apply. And a lot of times we help them with that because, as you'll see today, those rules are pretty complex. But he's an engineer. He's worked with us for almost 5 years, and I can attest he's great to work with. And he also helps me with a lot of the trainings that we do for the regulated community and even for our internal staff. So he doesn't write an air permit in a bubble. He works with Brian Hughes, who's our toxicology manager, and we have 4 toxicologists currently that work for Brian. And although he manages the toxicologists, what they primarily do is they guide our permit engineers on levels of toxic air contaminants that are protective of human health during the permitting process. So they do stuff outside of that too. They also take our group of toxic air contaminants and they help figure out, based on real sciencey information, what levels of those air toxics can be in communities and still be protective. So they have a really cool job. It's hard, but also really interesting. So another person that they work really closely with during air permitting is Stephanie Hengesbach, and she does air modeling. So if you were on a minute ago when Mark was talking about Michigan doing fence line modeling, we do fence line modeling. We all modeling in the community. So we look at what are going to be those worst case impacts. And that's what Stephanie does. And she's great. She's a meteorologist. She's worked with our air quality division for 18 years. And she works with our permit staff to kind of determine what those impacts are. And it's all based on what the company is asking for. So we take that information and do a lot of evaluation on it. Another really cool thing that she does here in Michigan is she forecasts or helps forecast our clean air action days. So like today, when we have really high levels of ozone, or we expect to, her and one of our other meteorologists are the ones who actually call those days and help get those announcements out through the AQI. So all 3 of these folks have really, really cool jobs. I'm going to actually pass it over to Chuku, right? And Chuku is going to talk a little bit about what happens when a company comes in and asks for a permit that has toxic air contaminants in it. Now I'm going to turn my camera off so you people don't have to just stare at me.
Thank you very much, Jen, and good afternoon, everyone. As Jen said, my name is Chuku OJ, and I'm a permit engineer. I work on a vast number of sources when writing permits, but I also happen to manage and update one of the tools that is used in the air toxics review. That can be found on our website. And here's a quick link to the page. But before I get into sort of the toxics review, I kind of wanted to do a quick primer on air toxics in Michigan. My colleague Brian Hughes is going to elaborate a little bit more, but I wanted to give sort of the rough definition. As a lot of you are aware, in the state of Michigan, we regulate a class of pollutants known as toxic air contaminants. You might have heard the term air toxics bandied about. Those two are interchangeable, but we also say TAC for short. And this class is separate from that of criteria pollutants and hazardous air pollutants. However, with special note, hazardous air pollutants also fall under the class of toxic air contaminant. There are various rules that sort of govern toxic air contaminants. However, the four really important ones when it comes to the permit review, both when the permit application is being prepared and when the permit engineer is reviewing the permit application, those rules are 224. That has to do with best available control technology for toxic air contaminants. It's basically when you have the process, are you using the best available controls to limit emissions of toxic air contaminants? And that sort of review is a little more streamlined than, let's say, the BACS review for VOCs or another criteria pollutant. But I just kind of wanted to give like a rough definition of that. I won't go into it too much because I want to focus on the latter three rules, which have to do with the air toxics review. Those rules being 225, 226, 227. 225 is the important one because it essentially says that if you have a new or modified source, and there are kind of some different definitions of modified, but essentially if you are making a change to your process in some way, shape, or form, or if you are installing a new process, toxic air contaminants that are emitted must comply with their respective screening levels. And if you aren't aware of what screening levels are, my colleague Brian Hughes will go into more detail. Rule 226 has to do with exemptions from performing the air toxics review. So sometimes you will find that if the emissions for certain toxic air contaminants are small enough and they are not carcinogens or on the list of TACs of high concern, they may be exempt from air toxics review, as they may be presumed to be in compliance with the air toxics regulations. Rule 227 is kind of like the other big important one because it has to do with how a facility is going to demonstrate compliance with the air toxics rules. And to that effect, I will now share my screen and show the tool that we use to perform that review. So as I mentioned earlier, this spreadsheet can be downloaded from our website. Just click on the link below, scroll down, and you can download it. And essentially, this spreadsheet is a little nifty tool for showing whether or not the impacts of the various TACs that are emitted from your process, whether they will be below their screening levels. And if you look, there are, I'm going to hide this. There are sort of three main tabs, and each of these tabs that are sort of labeled Rule 227, 1A, B, or C highlight the three methodologies that are used. The first methodology is AER, and that stands for the allowable emission rate. This methodology is sort of seen as the most conservative. You plug in an emission rate and it will pull from our database of screening levels for various TACs, and it will show you whether or not the impacts at the proposed emission rate will be below the screening level. So right now we have a couple of examples. So let's say you have a process. Our facility is called Acme Inc. because why not? One of the, it's emitting one TAC, formaldehyde. So we enter in its CAS number, and you can enter the CAS number with the dashes or without the dashes. It's designed to search our database for this CAS number. And what it will do is it will pull up the screening levels available, and it will also sort of use different formulas to calculate the AER, the allowable emission rate. This is essentially the screening level, but sort of translated as an emission rate. Once you've entered your CAS number, we'll go to the max hourly emission rate. So let's say this process at Acme emits 0.004 pounds per hour of formaldehyde. You'll see here that it's kind of calculated an emission rate that is based on 24 hours. So that if you go back to the screening level, each screening level will have sort of an averaging period, whether it's 1 hour, 8 hour, 24 hour, or annual. And one TAC can have multiple screening levels. So sometimes they can have 1, 2, or even 3. And you'll see here in this column, once you enter your screening, your emission rate, it will tell you whether or not the emission rate from your process is below the AER. If you are below the AER, you are considered passing the air toxics review, and it is understood that the project will comply with the rules. So what happens when you have a situation where you are not passing on AER? With that, we'll use formaldehyde as an example again, and let's up the emission rate to say 0.005 pounds per hour. You'll notice in row 7 that for this screening level, the URSL, the monthly emission rate is greater than the AER. So that means that the TAC right now is currently not passing. However, there are a couple of options, and to that, we will go to the next tab, which is for AIR. And AIR stands for Ambient Impact Ratio, and it's essentially a pseudo form of modeling where there is a sort of special table right here in table 22, where you will have various factors that are a ratio of the emission rate and a model and a concentration. And that factor will be based on a number of parameters. So for example, the stack height and the building height, and also the property line distance. So that's the distance from the building of a stack height of, let's say, 10 feet to the nearest property line. So going back to this tab, we'll have formaldehyde, same emission rate. And then let's say that the process is in a building with a building height of 15 feet, stack height of 20 feet. And let's say that the property line distance to the nearest property line is about 1,600 feet. Entering that information, it's going to give us sort of the relationship between the stack height and the building height, which will then be used to sort of select the correct AIR. And based on that AIR, a sort of maximum emission rate will be calculated. And that is what the proposed emission rate will be compared to. And when we look at the proposed emission rate of 0.005 pounds per hour, the maximum emission rate based on the screening level, we see that it's below. So if your emission rate is below, if your emission rates are below these two values, you're considered to have passed on AIR, you're one and done. However, what happens if you're not passing on AIR? Let's up the emission rate again to 0.1 pounds per hour. Make it interesting. Keep the same building characteristics. And again, we're not passing on this one particular screening level. The last methodology we have is referred to is the dispersion modeling. So that's modeling, done typically on AirMod or screen or some form of dispersion modeling like it. And that modeling is used to develop what we call PAIs, predicted ambient impacts. And these impacts are typically a concentration based on the stack characteristics, so height, diameter, the airflow, temperature, all that jazz, meteorological information if we're using AirMod. And we will have concentrations typically on a 1 hour, 8 hour, 24 hour, or annual. These generic impacts can be used to derive the individual impacts that are in this column. So going back to our example of formaldehyde, when we have the emission rate of 0.1 pounds per hour, instead of an emission rate here, we are going to instead end up with a concentration, our PAI. So these are the impacts that are going to be associated with that emission rate. And now we're looking to see if these impacts are going to be less than the screening levels. So the screening levels are essentially a concentration that you have to stay below. So we look for both concentrations, are they below their various screening levels? Yes, they are. So if you're at the point where you've done AER, AIR, and modeling, and everything has passed, you'll do this for each TAC. When you pass on a certain TAC, you'll leave it there, and then you'll continue on to the next methodology for TACs that you do not pass. However, if you end up in a situation where after using all three methodologies, you are not passing. So we have this example here where we up the emission rate to 1 pound per hour based on the modeling results. That is where typically there will be discussions with the permit engineer on what the applicant can do to demonstrate compliance. And sometimes this will involve updating the stack characteristics. So if a stack has been designed for, let's say, 20 feet, maybe you might have to raise the stack. Maybe you might have to change the diameter of the stack, and that's going to be reflected in the permit. Maybe you might have to take a limit based on the averaging period for the screening level. So in this case, for this screening level, this is understood to be an annual base screening level. You might have to take an annual throughput, or you might have to take an emission limit or hours of operation restriction. Something to get the impacts to being below the screening level. And then there are other situations where you might have an air toxic contaminant that does not have an AQD assigned screening level. So I'm just going to write a dummy screening level here. This is just our contaminant. We don't care what it is, but at the moment, we don't have a screening level. It's coming up blank. So one of the common misconceptions in doing the tax review in Michigan is that if a compound does not have a screening level pop up in our database, we don't necessarily need to review it. That's not true. We still need to look at it, but we have another way of doing it. And typically, for toxic air contaminants without screening levels, we will then pass it on to the toxicologists. We need the CAS number, the emission rate, most likely, and then the impacts on both on a 1 hour, 8 hour, 24 hour, and annual averaging time. And as my colleague Brian will explain, they will perform their review, and they will determine whether or not it is going to comply with the regulations. And sort of before I conclude my talk, I kind of wanted to talk about the modeling piece as well, because typically the modeling will be performed by the applicant. when we do receive the modeling results, typically the permit engineer will send the modeling results to the modeling unit. So my colleague Stephanie and her colleagues, one of them will either perform a QA, QC of the modeling just to verify that everything looks good, or there will be sort of in-house modeling performed if there is any specific impact we need. And with that said, that kind of concludes my sort of short talk on the air toxics review. If you have any questions, definitely feel free to save them for when we have the chance for questions. And on that note, I am going to pass it off to Brian.
Thank you, Chuku. That was very, very good. I appreciate it. I wish I were as smart as you were. I am going to try, this is going to be the proof of how intelligent I am, try to share my screen. And I'm going to have to ask if you all can see that.
Oh, Brian, you did it good right the first try. I'm pretty impressed with you.
Hey, even a blind pig can find an acorn.
I know, I love it. We didn't even practice this ahead of time, so it's good.
All right, great. Okay, well, so Chuku is going to review the permit, and he's going to compare the nature and the extent of the emissions to our existing screening levels. And right now, what you see on the screen is a website that contains all the screening levels that we have. We have over 1,200 of the screening levels. So if you click on that website, you'll come up with a search and query page or query and search page. And all you have to do is put in a cast number or a name. And if we have that screening level, it'll come up. But if the screening levels haven't been established for a TAC, then we need to provide one. And Chuku will either ask us to come up with a screening level, or he will give us a protected ambient impact and ask if it's low enough so that it reasonably expected not to cause any harm. So in either case, the toxicologists will need to get to work to try to come up with a screening level that is health protective. And so we'll have to do a literature review and determine the chemical and physical properties and gather any human exposure, animal data, and determine a dose response relationship to try to come up with a screening level. Chuku did mention Exemption Rule 226, which kind of states that if the emissions are low enough and it's non-carcinogenic, then there is an exemption for that. And if there's any question to whether the compound is carcinogenic or not, he'll ask us whether or not that compound has any carcinogenicity associated with it. All right, so we have two types of screening levels. We have what is called a initial threshold screening level, or something we call an EGLE, and it's either annual or short term, which is 1, 8, or 24 hours. We also have what are called EGLEs, which are initial risk screening levels. These are for cancer effects, and it's either 1 in a million, which is the ERSL, or 1 in 100,000, which is our CERSL. So the CERSL is more facility-wide cancer screening level. So as Chuku said, the engineer will provide us with a request and the cast number and the name and the predicted ambient impact. And we will try to conduct a literature review and determine the best scientific rationale for basing a screening level. Our screening levels are kind of prescriptive. They are written in rules 231 and through 233. These provide the general methods and equations for deriving our screening levels. Rule 231 provides a rationale for developing the screening level based on carcinogenic effects. So we'll look to the literature to determine whether or not there is any cancer potency factors or inhalation unit risk factors that we can use to come up with the ERSLs or the CERSLs. A lot of times, if you're not dealing with a carcinogen, then you go to Rule 232, which provides a hierarchy in the development of a non-cancer screening level. So the hierarchy consists of this. If the EPA has already conducted a risk assessment for a chemical resulting in a reference concentration, then we can just use what is called the RFC and adopt that value as our screening level. If there is an oral RFD, then we'll convert that to an inhalation value and use that for a screening level. Then we go to the next step in our hierarchy. So if we don't have an EPA derived reference concentration or an RFD, we'll look to see whether there is some sort of occupational effect level, either a TLV from ACGIH, a MAC level, or another sort of appropriate occupational screening level. And we can use that so long as it's well documented and there's a good scientific basis for that level. We never use that level directly. We divide it by 100, because obviously occupational exposure levels are based on 8 hours, 40 hours a week, and it's because we are dealing with an occupational level where you have a healthy worker effect. We do use uncertainty factors of 100 to kind of take that OEL and turn it into a screening level that's appropriate for the general population. If we can't find an OEL or we can't find an RFC or an RFD, then we'll look for appropriate animal studies. And we can create a screening level based on an animal study that is subacute, that's of 7-day, the least which is 7-day. We can do it if we find studies that are 28-day, 14-day, or 90-day. But in any case, when we look at studies, animal studies, we always look for the inhalation studies first. And then we can take that inhalation study and again, dividing by an appropriate factor, which would actually reduce that inhalation down to going from like a 7-day to an annual level for more chronic exposure. We can use that value to come up with the screening level. Again, also dividing by 100 to come up with a level that is more meant for the general population based on uncertainty factors of an animal to human or the most sensitive in human in a population. But nevertheless, we always look to a study which is inhalation first, then to an oral study. And if we do find that there are only oral studies, we'll make another adjustment to be making it appropriate for the general population. If we cannot find any of the aforementioned studies or values, then some of our rules do allow us to extrapolate a screening level based on a lethal concentration 50 or an LD 50. So, and those actually entail huge uncertainty factors to come up with a screening level. And in the event there is no experimental toxicological data for a particular chemical, we use a default value of 0.1 microgram per cubic meter. So like I said, our rules 231 through 233 kind of outline how you can derive a screening level. We report that back to the engineer. We report that back to the engineer whether or not the PIA is okay. That is to say that the PIA is lower than a level established by our rules. If the engineer thinks that that chemical has a certain priority or that we'll see it a number of times, we can include that on our chemical under review list and come up with a full-fledged screening level. It isn't a screening level at this time until it goes through a public comment period. And we write a justification document. It goes through a public comment period, and then we actually write up our response to comments. So when we look at rules 231 through 233 and come up with what we call a screening level, it really doesn't get put onto our list of screening levels that I showed you back in the first slide until we write up a justification document, that is to say, our scientific justification for coming up with that particular sort of concentration, and take it through a process of public comment, and then answer those public comments in a written form and place it on our website. Facilities, based on the information in rules 231 to 232, can actually submit their own screening levels. But the industry should provide the documentation on which the screening level is based. Any screening level that's offered by the industry will be reviewed by our toxicologists. We'll have to go through the process of looking at the literature and coming up with the correct science on which to base that screening level. So yes, facilities a lot of times will submit their own screening levels, basically to have some confidence in that their permit is going to pass. But sometimes a industry will just see, for example, on a safety data sheet, an LD50, and will just use that to derive a screening level and don't do the deeper dive into the information, do a literature search and the scientific information behind it. And that's what we do. We do get out monthly updates on our screening level changes, and we do publish our chemicals under review list. And you can join a listserv, which you'll be notified of any of those changes. And again, our existing screening levels can be found at this website. So that's kind of a brief overview of screening levels and how we actually come about to set those levels, and then look at the data that Chuku provides to determine whether or not those predicted ambient air concentrations do meet our health-based criteria. So with that, I think Stephanie is next on the list.
I will go ahead and try to share my screen. I think Brian actually just stopped sharing before I can share my screen. Okay. All right. Can you guys see my screen?
Yep. You're like old hat at this stuff.
Well,
I know you know how to use.
Just want to make sure.
Oh, you're good.
Okay, my name is Stephanie Hengesbach. I'm one of the dispersion modelers here at Air Quality Division. I only have a couple slides, going to go through just a quick overview of what dispersion modeling is. And when Chuku does get an application and does deem through the AER and the AIR table that dispersion modeling is needed, kind of where we take it from there. So basically what we do when dispersion modeling is needed for an application, we do follow EPA guidance, and we use the EPA recommended dispersion model called AirMod. And this slide right here shows the software that we use to run AirMod, kind of what it looks like on our end. And the whole purpose of modeling is to build the facility in a computer program. We want to build the buildings, we want to put in the stacks, everything kind of how it's laid out. And pretty much running the model, the end result of that is to determine what the ground level impacts are for different pollutants. Now in this picture, the blue shapes represent buildings at this particular facility that I'd modeled I'm not even positive where this one was anymore, but the blue shapes are buildings. The two red kind of plus signs or crosses up on the a little bit northern portion, the darker blue building, those represent stacks that exist on that building. And impacts only need to be determined in what we call ambient air. And ambient air is the air the general public has access to. So that white space surrounding the buildings, that represents the secure property boundary of the facility. And impacts don't need to be calculated there because the general public does not have access to that area. Now, the green plus signs, as you go further out, those represent what we call in the modeling world receptors, or we also call them virtual monitors. Now, the receptors in a model act as a virtual monitor while the model is run, and the whole reason for these receptors are to determine what the future impacts would be from the different pollutants being emitted at this facility. Again, the modeling is going to determine the ground level impacts at each one of these plus signs, and these receptors, virtual monitors, we have usually thousands of them in a model run. We do start the receptor spacing around the secure property boundary, if there is a secure property boundary around a facility, and then we'll go out from there. Usually for toxic pollutants impacts, the maximum impacts occur within a few kilometers of the facility, but really there isn't a set distance that you absolutely have to go out to. You just need to make sure that when modeling is done by a consultant or when we do it internally ourselves, that we encompass that maximum impact. So if you do a grid that's only a kilometer away from the facility, and at the edge of your grid, you have an impact that's seems to be increasing, then you're going to want to extend the grid out and go further just to make sure you're encompassing that maximum impact. And again, usually the maximum impact occurs pretty close into the facility, if not at the boundary itself, just a few kilometers from there. Now, after we get this facility built in a computer program, we do add terrain into the program, we add meteorology into the model, and then we run it. And running the AirMod model basically simulates what happens to the emissions as they're exiting the stack and as meteorology is applied to those emissions. For toxics, we consider, we do add 1 full year of meteorology into the model itself because we want to make sure we encompass the worst case meteorology conditions over that year when we determine the maximum ground level impacts. And again, impacts are calculated for each one of these plus signs. So there are literally hundreds to thousands of impacts when you get the model run when it's finished. And the second slide here, what this is this side represents the end result of the model, again, which is determine the magnitude and location of our impacts. The picture on the left is what it looks like in our software itself. There is a nice feature that we can export this over to Google Earth so you can get a better idea on the area where the impacts are. And that's the picture to the right, are the concentrations and the contours overlaid on Google Earth for this particular facility. So really what we do on our end from here will determine these impacts. Usually for a toxics analysis, sometimes we do toxic specific modeling. More often than not, we'll do a generic run, which means we'll get a generic, let's say 1 pound per hour impact for all the different averaging times. We will pass those numbers on to the permit engineer. And then from there, they will go ahead and, like Chuku had showed you in the tables, put our generic impacts in there to in turn calculate what the actual concentrations are for the different pollutants that he gets in his table. So we really do work with them. And like Brian had mentioned too, when a screening level is not set for a pollutant, sometimes we'll go ahead and do a generic analysis and provide these generic impacts to the toxics groups so that they can go ahead and use them in their review of setting a screening level for the different pollutants. So basically, that's what I have as far as modeling goes. So I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen.
All right, so now is when you guys can ask questions, Donovan. I saw your hand up earlier and then go back down again. But hopefully what you guys got out of this is that this is a pretty involved process, or at least it can be, which is why when we get complaints that air permits take a really long time, we're like, well, we're doing a lot of really cool stuff in the background to make sure that what you're asking for is protective of the community. So one of the things that I always find really interesting when we do public meetings is, especially when Stephanie or her coworker Jim Haywood come to talk, and they talk about the modeling, which to me is like really cool. Who doesn't want to have a bunch of virtual air monitors in their backyard to make sure that everything's good? People just don't get it. We've modified how we talk about this so many times with folks, and we just still, I don't know if we're like not hitting the mark, we're missing the mark a little bit, but people don't understand that we're basically taking that worst case, like Stephanie said, and saying like, okay, if we put the worst case thing here, are you still going to be okay? And, obviously that plays in a little bit differently when we're talking about our environmental justice communities and folks that are already feeling overburdened. And these models don't always account for cumulative impacts. Sometimes they do. And we've talked about that too, Stephanie and I, and how we can talk with community about that. But it's definitely a complex issue when a company comes in for an air permit and we need to make sure that they're following all the rules and regulations from a federal level. And then also obviously with our state air toxics rules. So did anybody have any questions? Donovan, did you get your question answered already, or do you have something else you wanted to add?
Not entirely, Jennifer. So on the air emissions, AER and such, are these reported numbers that Michigan has to like their air emissions reporting requirements?
So that's an interesting question. So what we do for our air emissions reporting is we require companies to report the criteria pollutants like they would normally, and they can report their hazardous air pollutants and their toxic air contaminants or their tax if they want to. Our program actually does do a lot of calculation in the background that it reports to EPA. A lot of companies, especially ones that have permit limits. So like if Chuku would write a permit that would have a permit limit for a specific TAC that would have to be reported through our air reporting system, we would strongly encourage that company to report their actual emissions of that TAC if they have to keep records of it, because otherwise the program is using like what inherent information it has to calculate that emission, which may or may not be actually accurate. So for instance, we've had cases, especially like recently with ethylene oxide. I think folks are pretty familiar with what's been going on with that, where we used our air emissions reporting system, and normally folks wouldn't have to tell us how much ETO they emitted because it's not a criteria pollutant. But we use that information, what was being calculated in the background, to say like, okay, do we have any facilities that we might want to look at that, are getting this calculated based on their standard classification codes, something that we need to look into a little bit more. So that's happened with ETO, that's happened with some of our tax, metal tax as well in the past, where we've used that information to target. So no, it's not required is the short answer to that question. Be cool if it was, but it's not.
Okay, that's good to know, because it sort of falls into the questions I've been asking the group the past week or so in relation to air emissions reporting requirements. So if it's not required, I do like the spreadsheet, and this is something that businesses would fill out to determine how easy has it been for smaller businesses to determine their pounds per hour emissions of specific HAPs? Has that been an issue, or is it usually some of the mid-sized to larger businesses that have better understanding of that?
I mean, Chuku would know maybe more about some of the questions that he gets. So, but it's a really good question. Before we didn't have this spreadsheet. So once Chuku and one of his fellow permit engineers, Michelle Rogers, were able to sit down and develop this to try to make it a little bit easier. It does so much of the work for you. If you know a little bit about what you're emitting, you can at least kind of guesstimate where you're going. And then we also have some of kind of like a varying degree of digging deep into that spreadsheet of training that's recorded. So we were doing quarterly training on this when we were still in person, but we actually have been did some training modules that we recorded. We have like a mini version, and then we have sort of like a longer version. Staff will also do what they call pre-application meetings, which is basically like the permittee comes in with whatever they have and they meet one-on-one with a permit engineer, and they don't have to come in. Obviously, we did that virtually too, and kind of go through that stuff. So I think the smaller companies, as always, the reason they have more trouble with it isn't necessarily like they don't have the knowledge of their process, but it's more like they don't have a person who focuses on that. And so for me personally in my work, and I know you guys do this too, what I run into is smaller businesses that once they get their permit and we've helped them through that, then they need record keeping help. And I'm sorry, I don't know why my cat's meowing at me right now. I don't know if you guys can hear that or not. She's kind of old and craggy. But they have problems with their record keeping. So what do we do with them afterwards? And how do we keep them in compliance and give them an easy way to calculate their emissions based on what they're using? So I haven't really found that a lot of smaller businesses are coming to me and saying, hey, we don't know how to use the tax spreadsheet. It's more like we don't know that there's a tax spreadsheet. And then I'm able to at least have some guidance for them at this point, along with, we also have a guidebook that kind of walks them through a little bit of the process as well. Chuku, do you have anything else you want to add to that from your experience with talking to permittees?
Sure. I think I kind of do agree with your assessment, Jen, that part of the issue and I think we do see it a lot more with smaller facilities is not having a person on staff with the knowledge base of how to perform the review itself. I think also another issue that comes up is it comes when quantifying the pound per hour emission rates, because, and I think this is due to a lack of communication on our end, is what are the appropriate emission rates for a TAC to be used in the review, depending on the methodology. And I didn't mention it during my presentation, but for AER, typically we're using the maximum hourly emission rate that's based on, let's say, the capacity of the process, the rated capacity, and we'll factor in any natural or inherent bottlenecks. So something that would be an inherent bottleneck is, let's say that the boiler is designed to only run at 5,000 pounds per hour, but maybe you only have enough power to run it at this rating, and you can demonstrate it or something like that. Typically, some facilities will use an average hourly emission, so they'll take their ton per year emission rate and then they'll divide it by 8760 and say that's their max hourly emission rate. For AER, typically that's not seen as acceptable if you can find the max hourly emission rate. And that's just due to how AER, the methodology, was designed. You have to use the max emission rate to get the most conservative result. For AIR and dispersion modeling, you can use average hourly emission rates under specific guidelines. So for example, they have to be greater than 10% of the max emission rate. If the average emission rate is too low, that's also not seen as appropriate.
And I think Chuku's right. I mean, it's interesting in that, like, a lot of the things we deal with, as you guys know, being assistance folks, I always get questions, even this morning, I have a heat treat oven that we're installing. Do I need a permit? Well, in that case, based on a few questions, I can figure out if they need a permit or not. But if they did have to come in for a permit, the things that they would have to do from a small business perspective can feel very overwhelming. And just like talking about tax stuff here in Michigan, it's really cool. It's interesting and it's great. I feel like that we go above and beyond. And like Brian said, we have over 1,200 tax that we regulate, and we're constantly looking at those and adding more and changing those screening levels so that they're as protective as they can be. But from a small business perspective, it can be very overwhelming to see that checklist of things that you have to do. And for them, looking at that spreadsheet and saying, okay, I have to figure out how to use this, can be really overwhelming. And it's like, you know, why you just showed me a form, like, why can't I just fill this form out and give it to you? It's one page and then you can give me a permit. Like, I don't understand. So I think that's a lot of what we get to try to overcome as well, which is why we try to have as many resources as possible when it comes to talking about such a complicated issue. And when we have small companies, like we have some sort of relatively small companies going out for public comment soon that do plastic reinforced composites. So like styrene emission companies, and they're fairly small. So they don't necessarily have staff people on that know how to determine how much styrene. Do they have other HABs? Are there tax in there that they haven't, you know, how do you look at an SDS and say like what's coming out of there? What if the SDS doesn't really give you a lot of information, because a lot of times they don't either. How does a small business, you know, allocate resources to figuring that out? And how much as a agency can we help them do that without like actually doing it for them? So I don't know if that answers the question, Donovan, but I think kind of talking about the hills and valleys to things like this is also really important.
Yeah, it does come a lot closer. And of course, one of the issues with reinforced plastic composite manufacturers is looking at the SDS does not give you the emissions because you have to also look at the unified emissions table. And since we're talking about, do you have a general estimate of how many reinforced plastic composite manufacturers might be in Michigan?
Oh, geez. I don't know. Chuku, do you have a number? I mean, we could find that out pretty easily. It wouldn't be hard.
I do not know.
Okay. All right. That's a question for later. All right.
Yeah, we can talk about that at another technical subcommittee meeting. I think that would be a really interesting topic, actually. So does anyone else have any questions on tax? Do you feel overwhelmed? Would you like to practice using the spreadsheet?
Jennifer, this is Mark.
Yes, Mark.
I'm curious. Again, I don't know that I gleaned a lot. Again, this deals with the air permitting process. So it's an application where there's the potential for the use of one or more toxic air contaminants.
Mm-hmm.
Are you able to do any type of analysis where, you know, as applications have been received over time, you've had to do less of an analysis for certain toxic air contaminants, you know, because maybe people have eliminated one of the toxic air contaminants in lieu of a non-toxic substitute?
Mm-hmm. No, that's a really interesting question. I think that that's something that we could potentially look at. I don't know that our records are kept in such a way. We could certainly look at trend data in emissions reporting, which would give you something. But what comes to mind for me is like in Minnesota, where they just banned TCE, right? So are they going to see, that shift from TCE to something not as toxic? Like I think for a while we were seeing a shift from TCE to N-propyl bromide, but now, I mean, obviously that's not as much. Chuku, do you want to chime in on that one?
Yeah, and I'm going to answer it from the permit perspective. So from that end, I don't know if we would necessarily do less of an analysis if a certain compound was banned per se. Obviously, it would if a facility comes in for a permit application, they would likely be using for a new process, or they're modifying their existing process. We would still have to perform the TAC review, and we would review all of the TACs that are being emitted. And I kind of wanted to sort of address the toxic versus non-toxic, because that's also an area where there's a source of confusion, because we do get a lot of consultants outside of Michigan or facilities outside of Michigan that tell us that, you know, this compound is certified as an environmental compound, it's green. However, we have a definition for toxic air contaminant, which is very broad, and all it says is that it is an airborne contaminant that does not have a national ambient air quality standard. So if it's emitted, it doesn't have a NAAQS, and it's not on the list of compounds in the rule that are considered quote unquote not attack, then it is something that we would review.
So thank you for that. I think that was some very good leeway that was built into that definition.
So,
I
as a follow-up, I
Mhm.
know body shops have been kind of near and dear to our hearts, and a lot of body shops have been moving away or trying to do so from the metals in their paints and maybe some of the other constituents. So, if they move to something that was less harmful, if it's not on the list, then they still might be brought into this air toxic or this toxic air contaminant requirement to do modeling.
Well, it's the requirement to do modeling isn't just based on tax. So they're not necessarily always tied together. And I know that we are 1 minute, we're probably less than a minute, so I don't want to take up too much time, but you're going to love the fact, if you didn't remember this, that we don't really regulate body shops in Michigan. So yes. we
Oh,
didn't-
okay. So they wouldn't be
Right.
required to get a permit anyway.
Well, technically they should have permits if they need them. That's a whole, again, another conversation that we can probably have, Mark, but I see that it's 3, so I'm going to let you wrap it up and give your
Okay.
plug for next time. But thank you everybody for participating and listening. And again, my staff, I appreciate you guys coming in and talking to the team today.
And reinforced plastics, that would be a great topic. We had that once before, a few years back. I forget the lady from Kansas, but then I think there was someone from maybe Tennessee and one other person who presented on that. So that could be another topic if someone was willing to step up to the plate. I do want to call out Jennifer Wittenberg. She provided an idea of a future topic. And so I would encourage anyone else, if they have a topic in mind or something they would like to talk about, let me know. I'd love to be able to get people lined up so I don't have to think about, oh no, what am I going to do for August? Again, thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Chuku, OJ. Thank you, Brian. And thank you, Stephanie. It was very educational, very technical. I gleaned a little bit. So again, thank you. Anything else? Anyone else wants to add anything? Donovan, do you want to add anything?
Nope, I'm good.
Okay. Have a good day, and I'll see you next month. The talk there will be the use of Google Earth, and I do recall that being brought up during this discussion. So I hope that goes well. I'll see you in July if I don't see you at one of the other NSC calls. Have a good day.